Morning. I don't have a handout to go with this lesson this morning. If you are taking notes, if you want the title to go with the notes, it is The Invaluable Virtue, Contentment. The Invaluable Virtue, Contentment. You've probably heard it said, and likely a number of times throughout life, you've probably heard it said that money cannot buy happiness, right? And we understand the deeper meaning within that if you think about it, that money cannot purchase lasting satisfaction, fullness, completeness, wholeness, overall joy and happiness in our lives. And we understand that. It's something that is much deeper than that. And as a matter of fact, there's actually a lot of studies out there that would help us to prove that fact. If you were to research, if you went online and you actually Googled, okay, where are or what people are the happiest people in the world? What country do they live in where the happiest people of the world are? Most satisfied with life. What you're going to find is that Finland is at the top of this chart. Overall, happiest, most satisfied with life, that's where they're at, number one. Now, if you also did another search and you search for the wealthiest people in the world, the wealthiest countries in the world, what you're going to find is that wealth and happiness are typically on opposite ends of the chart. You see, where Finland ranks number one in overall happiness and satisfaction, they're actually in 30th in overall wealth in the world. And you might even start to think, okay, well, I wonder about this great nation that we live in, right? You think about how abundantly blessed we are, and you think about all the opportunities that are out there for us. And you think about how we have things, and we have things in so much abundance, you might think, okay, well, we must be a very happy people. You might be surprised to find out that we're around 25th in overall happiness and satisfaction of life, even maybe closer to 30th. Where when it comes to wealth, we're within the top 10. You see, our nation, wealth-wise, is 9th in overall wealth in the world. Yet our satisfaction of life, our happiness, is all the way down closer to 30th. And I just wonder if it is possibly because we're trying to place satisfaction, we're trying to find happiness in our nation, world, or in our nation, speaking in that term, if we're trying to find satisfaction in something other than where true joy and happiness can be found. One man said this concerning America. He says in the book titled The Hunger for More, he says, more. If there is a single word that summarizes America's hopes and obsessions, that is it, more. More success, more luxuries, more gizmos. We live for more, and the things that we now have pale in comparison to the things that we still yet to have, because we're constantly searching for more. And when I start thinking about that, I at least have to think, okay, well, maybe do we struggle with a contentment problem because we're always searching more? Well, I don't think it's just an American problem, right? I think if we're being honest about our world, it really is a world problem, a lack of contentment, constantly seeking for more things and not finding satisfaction in these things. Well, if I continue to think about it, I realize, look, it's not just a 21st century thing, but rather it dates all the way back to the garden. What was the problem in the garden? Was it not literally a hunger for more? A hunger for more than what God had offered them? More than what God had said they could have, and they ate of this fruit that was forbidden? A literal hunger for more was the problem. Well, I start thinking about that and realize, you know what, when I read through the Bible, it might actually surprise me where I start finding teachings about contentment. Think about it this way. You think about Timothy, and you think about how Paul speaks of Timothy. You're immediately going to recognize that he spoke of him as a son in the faith. He commended him because his mother and his grandmother, their faith that they had in the way that they raised him. He continued to commend him and say, look, if there was ever somebody that I need to go back and check on congregations that I can't get to, this man, Timothy, is the one that I can send. I can depend upon him. I can count on him. He will go, he will check on them, and he will report back to me. But even with as much good as he had to say to Timothy, he still felt the need to teach Timothy about contentment. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 5 through 11. I think about the congregation even there in Philippi. And I think about it in that time frame in the first century. If there was ever a congregation that somebody might want to be a part of, Philippi was one of those. This congregation was one that was prospering. They were doing great things. They were helping other people. They were assisting Paul even in his efforts. Yet Paul still felt the need to teach them about contentment in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. At the very least, when I start thinking about all these things, I start thinking about our world today, and I start thinking about even back in the first century and even all the way back to the garden, I have to realize that the want for more is a real problem. It's one that we face now, and it's one that Scripture often ties directly to a lack of contentment. All right, so 3 things I want us to consider this morning. Number 1, the call for contentment. Number 2, the danger of covetousness. And number 3, the reality of idolatry. And as we work through these, what we're going to see is when we become discontent, when we are no longer content with the things that God has given us, all of a sudden it leads to covetousness. And if we're not careful, that covetousness leads to idolatry. Okay? So let's consider the call for contentment. You know, oftentimes, even as we just spoke, when we think about the topic of contentment, we think about it in the sense that we have an abundance of things and maybe we still want more things. And then we begin to question with ourselves, okay, do I lack in contentment? Brandy and we were going to the store the other day, just a week ago, right? I have this lesson in my mind while we're doing this. We go to the store last week, and we were going to purchase her a new pair of shoes. And it wasn't the case that it was like on a whim. It wasn't the case it was last minute. This is something we talked about. We planned this out. We were looking for the right opportunity to spend this extra money, right? So the time had come. We go to the store. She knows the style. She knows the brand. She knows the color. She knows exactly what she wants. And she tells them, here's what I want. So they bring out the shoes and they say, well, look, we don't have the shoe size that you want, but we have one under and we have one over. So she has to now try them on and walk around the store some to make sure that they're going to fit right. Okay, now I have a moment, I start gandering around the store, right? I'm walking around, I'm looking, I get over to the men's apparel, right? Y'all thought I was going to be saying something about her lacking contentment, right? It's actually me. So I'm walking around the store and I'm looking at these jackets, right? And I come across this jacket and I sit there and I think, man, that's a good looking jacket, right? And I think to myself, be content with the things that you have, right? I don't need that, okay? So I'm thinking, I have 2 jackets at home. I have 2 hoodies at home. I don't need a jacket. And I turn around and look again. I'm like, man, that sure is a nice jacket. And I thought to myself, you know what? That looks a lot like a jacket I used to have. As a matter of fact, it was one of my favorite jackets, and I wore that thing all the time. And I started thinking about verses like, you come into the world with nothing, you're going to leave this world with nothing, right? And I'm really having this struggle. Well, we get ready to check out. And, of course, we go to the register and we purchase a new pair of shoes and we purchase a new jacket, right? So I begin to question, do I struggle with contentment? You know, and oftentimes that's how we think about it. As far as we have things and we want more things. Well, it may be the case, okay, well, we're blessed and we have the ability to get more things, but does that necessarily mean I lack contentment? There are other people in the world who live in situations, say, where they have a single room house. An entire family lives in a single room that might be no bigger than one of our kids' bedrooms, with a thatch roof, 90-degree weather, with no air conditioning, with a dirt floor. Because they live in that, does it mean that they are more content in life than I am with the blessings that I have? I don't know if I can necessarily say that. There's at least a lesson in there that we could live with less than what we have, right? But simply having belongings, I don't think, and wanting things doesn't necessarily make us be lacking in contentment. Let's consider a few verses. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 7 through 8, because this is one of those we typically go to when considering contentment. All right, Paul says, for we brought nothing into this world, right? Sounds familiar. We brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. Okay, so if I want more than just food and clothing in life, does that mean I lack in contentment? If I want a shelter over my head, does that mean I'm lacking in contentment? Or is there a bigger lesson here that Paul is trying to teach Timothy? Possibly. All right, look at Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. This is another one we often go to. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave nor forsake you. Okay, well, does Paul mean to say that if I want anything more than what I currently have, then now I'm lacking in contentment? Or is there a bigger lesson here? And Paul is trying to teach him, look, or not Paul, excuse me, whoever wrote Hebrews, that is trying to say, look, don't covet the things that don't belong to you. Don't long for what is not yours, and be satisfied with the things that you have in life, and recognize that the fullness and happiness that you have in life comes from Jesus the Christ. Maybe that's the lesson he's trying to teach. All right, let's think about this. What we need to understand about contentment, because until I can understand that it's an inward issue, I don't think I can ever fully grasp it as an external issue. All right, so contentment could be explained this way. No matter what part of the world that you live in, no matter how much you have or how little you have, contentment is when you allow the fullness of God in your life to be sufficient and to produce happiness in your life no matter your circumstance. That's contentment. That's inward contentment. Watch how Paul explains this in Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 12. Paul, remember, this is one who is speaking in a sense where he's in a location that's not the most desirable. Remember, the Apostle Paul, when he writes the letter to the Philippians, he's actually in house arrest or at least in prison. Now he's writing this letter back to them to comfort them in their situation. Here's what he says. Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer in need. You see, here's where it's at. The Apostle Paul has just unlocked the very idea of the nature of what contentment truly means and where it really truly rests. He says, whether I have plenty or I have little, guess what? I'm okay because he's got me. He says, whether I am filled or I am hungry, I'm okay because he's got me. Whether I am wanting or I am well supplied, I'm okay because he's got me. I'm content with my every circumstance because God's fullness in my life is sufficient. When we start thinking about contentment, that's where it needs to start, inward, right? So let's process that. Self-realization. Self-realization, I am deficient. There is something that I am lacking in life. There is something that I need to make me whole, to make me complete, to make me happy so that I can experience life to the fullest. God actualization. God is sufficient. And he is what I need in my life to be full, to be complete, to live a life of happiness. All right? So what Paul is speaking of here is an inward sufficiency that becomes sustainable in any given circumstance, no matter what, because guess what? He's got me. That's where that contentment comes from. It's an internal satisfaction with an inward sufficiency that Paul's speaking of. And until I can truly understand that and take hold of that, I don't know that I could ever be content with everything else out here in this world. It starts within, right? Think about it this way. You take it back to thinking about our country and how we're ranked all the way down near 30th in overall happiness and joy, yet we're so high up the chart in overall wealth. And I ask the question, maybe is it the case that our country, overall speaking, generally speaking, is seeking for satisfaction in a place that satisfaction can't be found? You think about what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. Do you remember how Solomon spoke of his life? How there was nothing that he kept from himself? That anything that his heart desired, he went after it. Anything he wanted, he was going to have it. Anything that he wanted to do, he was going to do it. That was the life that he lived. Yet he still said, I was grasping at the wind when it came to satisfaction and happiness in life. Things can't be kings, right? Only Jesus can be king. He's the one that we need in our life. That's where true contentment begins, is finding satisfaction that God offers. One man said this. And it's interesting because this is actually an atheist who said this. He has willingly separated himself from God because of his choice not to believe in God, but he understands this fundamental truth. He said, if you want nothing, and want for nothing, you'll have everything. If you want everything, you will have very little. If it is things you desire, then things you will have, and things you will have in abundance. But if it's lasting happiness you desire, you have to look beyond the things. We can't find contentment in the things. We find contentment in the fullness that God supplies in our life. That's our sufficiency, okay? So keep that in mind as it pertains to contentment. Now let's discuss the danger of covetousness. Still thinking about God being sufficient in our life, that's where we find contentment. Now, the danger of covetousness. You might think of Luke chapter 12, right, when you start thinking about covetousness. Luke chapter 12, verse 15 and following. And what you're going to find there is the parable of the rich young fool. And it's a parable speaking of a man who found himself in a situation where all of a sudden he had things in abundance, and man, he had them overflowing. So much so that he was going to tear down his barn. He was going to build a bigger barn to hold all his goods. And he said to himself, look, I've done it. I have it all. I can sit back, eat, drink, be merry, right? All things are good. But the way that the parable goes, the reality is that his treasures that he had on earth created a poorness between him and his God. He was poor in spirit. He was poor spiritually. And Jesus said in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the things that he has. Okay, so there is a direct tie to the belongings that I can have. I can covet those things. That can create in me a lack of contentment and sufficiency that can be found in God. All right, so let's think about this. When I covet something, I begin to desire something so badly that my contentment in God then begins to diminish. So it's a loss in contentment for what God has to offer, with a corresponding rise in desire for things other than God, right? That's coveting. That's longing for things other than God or what God has blessed me with. Simply put, it could be said this way. I am not content when there is something that I crave so badly in this life that I don't have, that I feel like I cannot live without. And now all of a sudden God's not sufficient. Now it begins to affect my contentment in God. You know, oftentimes when we think about those who struggled with coveting, we might even think about David with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel chapter 11, right? Remember, David had all kinds of things. He was a greatly blessed man. He was a king over God's people, and he had things, and he had a multitude of things, yet he still coveted another man's wife. He longed for something that was not his, and his longing for that other something turned his heart, the man after God's own heart, momentarily away from God because he coveted another man's wife. All of a sudden you have murder, you have all kinds of other sins, adultery, all these things piling up because of that coveting. You might think about 1 Kings chapter 21. Think about Ahab with Naboth's vineyard, right? We're fixing to get there next Wednesday, because this Wednesday is a singing night. But Naboth's vineyard, this is one that Ahab wanted. He was so torn because he couldn't have this vineyard given to him. He went home, he wouldn't even eat, right? His countenance fell. He went in his house, he stomped around like a spoiled brat. He wanted this vineyard, and he wasn't going to be happy or satisfied until he got it. He coveted that vineyard, and his wife wrongly accused that man and had him stoned to death so that he could have it. That's covetousness, right? It's real serious when you start talking about it like that. You go back to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, where it says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with the things that you have, right? It makes more sense now. Don't long after the things that don't belong to me. Don't go in search of somebody else's belongings, but be satisfied with the things that I have in my life. It could be said this way, thinking about that and thinking about David and Ahab. Covetousness is this. Covetousness is when I run ahead of God and I try and choose for myself the life I think I need. Where contentment is waiting on God and being satisfied with the life that he knows I need, right? Running ahead of God. Go back to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, because Paul was also hitting on the fact of covetousness even within that same context in explaining contentment. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Start there in verse 5. All right, it says, useless wranglings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, who suppose godliness is a means of gain. From such withdraw yourself, right? Okay, so there's constant friction among some who are depraved in mind, who are deprived in truth, who imagine that godliness can lead to some sort of gain, right? Some people were making financial gain out of godliness, right? We would say hypocrisy. We would recognize that as whitewashed tombs, empty on the inside, outwardly expressing the life of God, expressing godliness so that they could gain financially, right? Hypocrisy. All right, now think about what he says there in verses 6 and 8, or 6 through 8. Now, godliness with contentment is great gain. Now it makes more sense, right? There are those who are seeking more than what God was offering. They wanted more from that, trying to use that as a means of gain. But he says to Timothy, look, godliness with contentment, that's where great gain is. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. In having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. All right? Now, we're looking at this text in its context. And though the word covetousness is not specified, it's not seen, at least the foolishness of it and the reward for it is. Look at verse 9. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptations and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Right? Sounds awful. Okay, what is at the core of this? What causes people to do this? Verse 10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Do you know how often the love of money is going hand in hand with covetousness, and how often it's spoke of in the same sense? As a matter of fact, some translations have actually taken Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5 that says, let your manner of life be without covetousness. Some have actually translated that, keep your life free from money, the love of money, which is covetousness, right? Directly ties to it. Now, here's where it gets real. When we talk about covetousness, we recognize how horrible it is. We recognize how badly it can harm our lives. We recognize how it can be the root also of all kinds of evil that can come up in our lives. It's probably the case that no one person wants everything, that no one person covets everything, but each person likely covets something at some point in their life. So while you may not covet all things, you have possibly coveted something. At least we recognize it's a human problem. You see, a college-age person, they might covet a particular life that they want to attain. They might covet a particular type of person that they want to spend their life with, a boyfriend or a spouse. They might want to covet a particular type of life that provides a particular financial level of life. Maybe you covet to come from a family that looks like that person's family. Maybe it's the case that you covet to have children like those people's children. Maybe you covet a job or financial stability that another person has, still looking at somebody else's belongings. Maybe you covet the belongings of someone else. My thought is, whatever that one thing is, might be the very thing that is keeping you from understanding the truth about true commitment or contentment. You see, that one thing that you covet, it might very well be the one thing that is keeping you from experiencing and being satisfied with the fullness of God in your life, because you're coveting other things. All right, now let's consider the reality of idolatry. Thinking about a lack of contentment and how that can lead to coveting for other things in this life. Now let's consider the reality of idolatry. Turn to Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. All right, Paul says, put to death your members which are on the earth: fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry. That's interesting. Okay, so covetousness, he says, is idolatry. I want to think about that for a minute. Think about the 10 Commandments. And think about what do you remember what the first commandment was that was given? You shall have no other gods before me. Do you remember what the 10th commandment was? Thou shalt not covet, right? Shalt not covet your neighbor's things, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife. So the first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. The last commandment is do not covet. Well, if the 10th commandment is do not covet, and the New Testament commentary on what it means to covet in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 says that when I covet, it is what? Idolatry. So God starts the 10 Commandments and he ends the 10 Commandments with essentially have no idols. Why? Because the fundamental problem of humanity, and maybe even the foundation of every sin that we commit, and the barrier that stands between us and our eternal God, is that we covet and we create idols because we're not satisfied with the things that we have. Maybe before we can understand what the secret of contentment is and actually experience that fullness of God in our lives, maybe we need to be more aware of what the root cause of our discontentment is. And that means that in my flesh, oh boy, am I prone to creating idols. I want for things that I don't have. I long for things that I see that other people have. And if I become so focused on wanting those things, all of a sudden I start losing focus of how much God means in my life. Covetousness and idolatry. How do I fight against it? If you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 11 through 12, remember Paul speaking of contentment there to Timothy about this matter. And we recognize at least the foolishness of covetousness and the reward for it is found also in that section. But he gives Timothy the answer, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 11 through 12, right? He says, flee from these things. Okay, what do we flee from? He says, flee from the love of money. Where do I flee to? He says, to your faith, right? He says, fight the good fight of faith. So my overcoming this lack of contentment is my turning to God, counting on him more, waiting on him more, trusting in him more, and letting my faith build in him, and not running out ahead of him and trying to take for myself the life I think I need, but rather being patient and allowing him to give me the life that he knows I need. That's the key to it. You see, here's the thing. All the time we talk about when it relates to sin, we need to run from sin. That's right, that's good. We need to run from it, but you have to have direction in which you are going. Just because you're running a different direction doesn't mean you're running in a better direction. Paul says if you're going to get away from this, you need to run to your faith. That's the right direction to run to, our faith in God. That will help us to overcome discontentment. That will help us to be satisfied with the life that God has blessed us with and not covet other things, which ultimately will lead to idolatry. If my affections and my desires, if my wants are things of this world, well, the things of this world I'll have, and I will have them in abundance. But again, things can't be kings. Only Jesus can be king. I have to make sure that I'm willing to set in my faith and trust in him and know that he is providing me with the life that he knows I need, and stop trying to run ahead of him. Here's the thing, that relationship starts through our obedience unto his gospel. That faith starts when I'm willing to admit that yes, he is Lord, and yes, that he is my God, and yes, it is him that I need in my life if I want to experience sufficiency, if I want to experience completeness, wholeness, satisfaction, and true happiness in this life. It starts with God, and it starts with my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. If you don't have them, if they're not set deep within your heart, you're going to continue to wander around aimlessly, searching for things to bring you satisfaction and things that never can bring satisfaction. Where's your relationship with him? How well do you trust on him? He wants us to have that life in abundance. He wants us to experience that life in abundance, but you have to be willing to turn to him. Maybe it's the case that you have not. You might still be searching for that one thing that will truly bring you satisfaction. It's him. we can help you with that. We can help show you exactly what it means to be a child of God. We can help show you what it means to be obedient unto His gospel and to receive all His blessings and blessings in abundance. But you have to be willing to take that step. Is God what you want in your life? If you have a need this morning, please let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.